In the 11th century, a fervor for religious devotion ignited a flame that engulfed Europe and the Middle East in a series of wars that came to be known as the Crusades. From the cities of Byzantium to the hills of Jerusalem, knights and peasants alike set forth to reclaim the sacred places of Christianity, battling their way through deserts, mountains, and treacherous seas. It was an age of chivalry and honor, but also of bloodshed and brutality, as East clashed with West in a struggle for power, wealth, and faith that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. It is a good idea to start by clarifying the nature of the Crusades. The Crusades were not about land, power, or money, at least, not initially. Contrary to popular belief, the Crusaders did not embark on their journey to the Holy Land solely for the purpose of gaining territory, wealth, or expanding their political influence. Instead, the Crusades were born out of a sense of religious duty and obligation, an obligation that, as Pope Urban II would put it in 1095, urged Christian knights and nobles to take up arms in defense of the Eastern Roman Empire and the holy places of Jerusalem. In fact, during the First Crusade, the Crusaders swore an oath of loyalty to the Eastern Roman Empire, known popularly today as the Byzantine Empire, promising to return formerly Byzantine lands to the Byzantines immediately upon their capture. This oath, however, did not work out as intended by the end of the Crusade. Moreover, the Crusades were not the first instances of violence between the Christian and Islamic worlds. The two had been in conflict for centuries before the Crusades began, with Muslim armies conquering previously Christian territories such as Syria, Egypt, and Palestine. The Crusades were thus not the start of hostilities, but was rather the latest in a series of a near constant, ongoing struggle. At its core, a crusade was an amalgamation of three distinct ideas: pilgrimage, holy war, and penance. Pilgrimage is a religious journey undertaken to visit holy sites. The Crusaders, however, combined this with the idea of a holy war rightly fought in the name of God, and in this instance, to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims. Additionally, the crusade was seen as a form of penance, a way for Christians to atone for their sins and seek redemption in the eyes of God. This idea was further reinforced by the concept of plenary indulgence, which granted full remission of sins and passage to heaven to those who took part in the crusade. The Crusades were the result of a complex set of factors. In the East, the Byzantine Empire had been under threat from Muslim forces since the 7th century. The Arab-Byzantine Wars saw the Levant fall under Arab control, weakening the Byzantines from further invasion. In the 11th century, the East-West Schism of 1054 further complicated matters, as the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church split, creating two distinct Christian factions. This strained the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and Western Christianity, with each side seeing the other as heretical. Meanwhile, the Turkic migrations of the 9th century saw many Turkic nomads from Central Asia migrate into the Muslim world, seeing a minor clan, the Seljuks, rise to power to control much of Iran, Iraq, and the Near East by the end of the 11th century. They invaded Byzantine Anatolia and defeated the Byzantines at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, taking important cities like Nicaea and Antioch soon after. This brought the Seljuks into direct conflict with Western Christianity, who saw these cities as important religious centers. At the same time, the Seljuks were in conflict with the Fatimid Caliphate, who controlled Egypt and much of the Near East, further dividing the Muslim world. Incursions into the Levant resulted in the Seljuks taking control of the city of Jerusalem in 1072, another important city in the eyes of Christians. Several deaths in the administrations of the Seljuks and the Fatimids in the 1090s, including the Seljuk Sultan and the Fatimid caliphs themselves, threw the Near East into chaos as rebellious emirs tried to gather power from themselves. The turmoil and confusion that distracted the Muslim world from news of the outside world, including the news of the upcoming First Crusade. Against this backdrop of Muslim invasion, Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent an appeal to Pope Urban II, looking for support against the Seljuks. Pope Urban II called for a council of the Church to be held in Clermont, France, in November 1095. The council was attended by archbishops, bishops, and abbots across Catholic Europe. The council discussed a range of issues, including the spread of heresy and the need to reform the Church's own practices. However, it was the final day of the council that would go down in history. On that day, Pope Urban II, according to 5 sources written after the end of the First Crusade, delivered a rousing speech to the assembled clergy and laity, in which he called for the Christian knights and nobles to take up arms in defense of Jerusalem and the Byzantine Empire. He spoke of the atrocities committed by the Muslims against Christian pilgrims, and of the need to reclaim the Holy Land for the Christendom. His speech was met with thunderous applause and cries of Deus vult, God wills it. The promise of the forgiveness of sins to those who took up the cross and went to fight in the Holy Land sparked a religious fervor in many. Peter the Hermit, a charismatic preacher, claimed to have received a vision from God, calling on him to lead the crusade. Many were inspired by his words and joined his cause. The People's Crusade was made up of a ragtag mob of peasants and petty knights, numbering up to 40,000 people. They were ill prepared for the journey ahead, and many died from disease, hunger, and exhaustion along the way. As they passed through the Rhineland, the People's Crusade encountered communities of Jews who were accused of being responsible for the death of Christ. The Crusaders attacked the Jews, burning down their homes and killing many of them. Despite this tragedy of the Rhineland massacres, the People's Crusade continued its journey, reaching Constantinople in August of 1096. They were met by the Byzantine Emperor Alexios. The People's Crusade proved to be a difficult group to manage, and many of them resorted to looting and pillaging the rural countryside. The People's Crusade were hurriedly ferried over to Anatolia. The Turks soon ambushed the peasants, massacring them in the thousands. Following the disastrous People's Crusade, legitimately armed and trained soldiers from Western Europe soon made their way to the Levant, reaching Constantinople in late 1096. After capturing several cities in Anatolia, the Crusaders arrived in Antioch in November of 1097. The city was heavily fortified and had a strong garrison. Despite this, the Crusaders managed to breach the walls and capture the city after a grueling 8-month siege. After the capture of Antioch, the Crusaders continued their march southward towards Jerusalem. Along the way, they captured several more cities, including Tripoli and Beirut. However, the capture of Jerusalem proved to be their most significant victory. In July of 1099, the Crusaders arrived outside the walls of Jerusalem. Like Antioch, the city was heavily fortified and had a garrison of several thousand soldiers. However, the Crusaders were determined to take the city, and after a month-long siege, they managed to breach the walls and capture Jerusalem. The capture of Jerusalem was marked by brutal violence and bloodshed. According to contemporary accounts, the Crusaders massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, killing 3,000 people in the process. The capture of Jerusalem was a significant achievement for the Crusaders and marked the culmination of their efforts to recapture the Holy Land. Following the capture of Jerusalem, the Crusaders established a series of Crusader states in the Levant. These states included the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli. The Crusader states were ruled by European nobles, who set about consolidating their power and establishing a new Christian presence in the region. By 1140 CE, Edessa grew to become a strategic city that had been held by the Crusaders for almost half a century. However, in 1144, Zengi, a Muslim leader, captured Edessa, massacring the Christian inhabitants. This loss came as a great shock to the Crusaders, and it sparked off another crusade to get it back. The news of the capture of Edessa spread rapidly throughout Europe, and in 1147, the German king, Conrad III, and Louis VII, the King of France, gathered 60,000 men and marched towards the Levant. The death of Zengi brought an even more determined figure on the scene, his successor Nur ad-Din. Nur ad-Din sought to unite the Muslim world against the Crusaders. Louis and Conrad were hampered by poor planning in Anatolia, experiencing disastrous defeat at the hands of the Seljuks throughout their march. Edessa would again be destroyed by Nur ad-Din after Crusaders tried to retake it. Salvaging the situation, Louis attacked the city of Damascus in 1148. After only 4 days, the siege of Damascus ended in disaster, ending the Second Crusade. Nur ad-Din emerged from the conflict as a dominant force in the region, and captured Antioch the following year. In the 1170s, the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt collapsed, and, rising from the ruins, rose the Ayyubid dynasty, led by Saladin, the famed Kurdish Muslim general. In 1187, Saladin scored a decisive victory against the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin, with Jerusalem falling soon after. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout Christendom, and Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade. Europe's monarchs answered the call, and in 1189, the Third Crusade began. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was the first to mobilize, but met an untimely death while crossing a river in Anatolia. King Philip II of France and King Richard of England also set out for the Holy Land. The Crusaders began by besieging the city of Acre. The siege lasted for 2 years, with the Crusaders finally capturing it in 1191. After, they marched towards Jerusalem, but were confronted by and defeated Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf. Despite their victory, the Crusaders couldn't retake Jerusalem, and Richard realized that he could not sustain a campaign in the Levant. In 1192, he signed a peace treaty with Saladin, which allowed Christians to pilgrimage to the Holy City, but it remained under Muslim control. Saladin died in 1193, with Jerusalem still in Muslim hands. Pope Innocent III called for a new crusade, but this time the Crusaders would attack Egypt and then go north. This required transportation by sea, which the Venetians could provide. However, when the Crusaders arrived in Venice in 1202, they found themselves unable to pay the exorbitant price for their transportation. To cover their debts, the Venetians had persuaded the Crusaders to attack the city of Zara, a Venetian-controlled port that defected to the Hungarians. The attack went against the Pope's orders, and led to the excommunication of the Crusaders. In 1203, the exiled Byzantine prince Alexios IV Angelos convinced the Crusaders to attack Constantinople and overthrow his uncle, the reigning emperor. Alexios promised to pay the Crusaders for their assistance. The Crusaders attacked Constantinople in April 1204, storming the city, and installed Alexios as emperor. However, the relationship between the people, the Crusaders, and Alexios quickly soured, and he was executed by his own people in just months after his installation. The Crusaders then proceeded to loot, sack, and pillage Constantinople, destroying many of its cultural treasures, slaughtering 400,000 civilians in the process, and burning down significant parts of the city. Venice emerged from the Fourth Crusade as the most significant power in the now former Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire split into four main parts: the Despotate of Epirus in the west, the Latin Empire around Constantinople, and the Byzantine aristocracy in the empires of Nicaea and Trebizond. The Latin Empire of Constantinople, established by the Crusaders, only lasted for 57 years before it was conquered by the Nicaeans in 1261. The Fourth Crusade ultimately failed in its initial goals, seeing only a small contingent actually sail to Egypt and reinforce Acre in the Holy Land. For the next 70 years following the sack of Constantinople, there would be another four crusades sanctioned by the Pope. By now, the Crusaders had recognized that the best way to retake Jerusalem would be by attacking the enemy's soft underbelly in Egypt. The Fifth Crusade, from 1217 to 1221, saw the Crusaders successfully attack the Egyptian port city of Damietta, but were defeated by the Muslim forces at the Battle of Mansura. The Sixth Crusade, from 1228 to 1229, saw the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II negotiate with the Muslim Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, and was able to regain control of Jerusalem without bloodshed, on the condition that Muslims could freely enter the Holy City. The Seventh Crusade, from 1248 to 1254, was led by King Louis IX of France. The seventh was more or less a repeat of the fifth. Louis was able to take Damietta, but saw disastrous defeat at Mansura. Louis himself was captured, but then freed after paying a hefty ransom. The Eighth Crusade, in 1270, was again led by King Louis IX. This time he attacked Tunis, but contracted dysentery and died before any significant battles took place. The crusade ended in failure. During the Seventh Crusade, the last Ayyubid ruler of Egypt, Al-Salil, died in 1249. His death launched a succession crisis for the throne of Egypt, in which Mamluks, slave soldiers utilized across many Muslim armies for quite a few centuries up to this point, took control of Egypt, establishing the Mamluk Sultanate. Beginning with the ascension of the former gifted general Baibars in 1260, the Levant was slowly carved up by the Mamluks. In 1268, Baibars sacked Antioch, establishing Mamluk rule in the region. The Levant was also subject to a new threat, the Mongol Empire, who conducted raids into Palestine on Ascalon and Jerusalem, but was decisively defeated by Baibars at the Battle of Ain Jalut. Afterwards, Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Levant, was conquered by the Mamluks in 1291. The Crusaders now took refuge on the island of Cyprus, until that too was sold off to the Venetians nearly 2 centuries later. The announcement of the Second Crusade in 1147 led to many German nobles deciding that they'd rather deal with the pagans in their own backyard. The Wendish Crusade started in 1147 and sought to Christianize the pagan Wends, a Slavic people who lived in Pomerania. The Crusaders initially achieved some success, but ultimately failed to Christianize the Wends. The failure of the Wendish Crusade led to the establishment of the Teutonic Order in the region, The Teutonic Knights were successful in their campaign against the Prussians and soon conquered the Livonians. The order also established a network of castles and forts throughout the region, which served as centers of administration and defense. The Teutonic Order's power in the Baltic declined in the late 1300s. Conflicts with its neighbors, including the Polish-Lithuanian Union, weakened its position. In 1410, the Order suffered a crippling defeat at Grunwald at the hands of the combined forces of Poland and Lithuania. In the 16th century, the Order became increasingly secularized, and its territories were gradually absorbed into the secular Duchy of Prussia. The Teutonic Order's decline marked the end of the Northern Crusades. The Cathar faith was a prominent faith in southern France in the 1200s. Catharism rejected the material world and believed in the existence of two opposing forces, one good and one evil. They believed that the material world was created by the evil force, and that the goal of human life was to return to the spiritual realm of the good force. Catharism was popular among the wealthy and educated classes of Languedoc, its influence extending to the local ruling nobility. The Catholic Church launched a crusade in 1209 with the aim of eradicating Catharism. Marked by horrible atrocities, the Crusaders sacked the city of Béziers, killing thousands of its inhabitants, both Cathars and Catholics alike. The Cathars fought back fiercely, but were ultimately unsuccessful. Many Cathars were burnt at the stake. The Inquisition was established in the aftermath of the crusade, its agents hunting down and prosecuting suspected heretics. By the end of the Albigensian Crusade in 1229, Catharism was effectively eradicated, and the region became more integrated into the French kingdom. However, the Crusade began a deep-seated resentment among the population of southern France towards the French crown, which would continue to simmer for centuries to come. The idea that the Crusades were defensive, or otherwise justified, has become a popular talking point between many, especially in light of horrible terrorist attacks and shootings. Those in far-right communities use the Crusades as a beacon of anti-Islamic and Christian nationalistic fervor, and have argued that centuries of Muslim expansion into previously Christian territories is proper justification for the Crusades to happen like they did. The truth, however, is a bit complicated. On one hand, proponents of the defensive view, like the far right, argued that the Crusades were a response to Muslim aggression against Christians in the Holy Land. They point to a long history of conflict between Christians and Muslims in the region and the persecution of Christian pilgrims to the Holy Land. They argue that the Crusades were a justifiable response to these attacks and an attempt to protect Christian pilgrims and holy sites in the region. On the other hand, critics argue that the Crusades were an offensive conflict aimed at expanding Christian influence and power in the Middle East. They point out that the Crusaders did not limit their attacks to Muslim forces, but also targeted Jews, Christians, and other non-combatants in the region. They also note that the Crusades were part of a broader pattern of European expansionism, in which European powers sought to expand their territories and influence beyond their borders. From this perspective, the Crusades were not a defensive response to Muslim aggression, but rather a form of imperialism aimed at advancing European interests. Additionally, some historians argue that the Crusades were a complex mix of both defensive and offensive motivations. The First Crusade could be perceived as a defensive conflict when you consider that the Byzantines appealed to Pope Urban II for help, and that the persecution of pilgrims was another deciding factor. Meanwhile, the Fourth Crusade could be perceived as offensive, as it was primarily driven by Venice's ambitions and interest in controlling Byzantine trade. At the end of the day, the question of whether the Crusades were a defensive or offensive conflict is a complex and contentious one, with arguments and perspectives on both sides of the spectrum. Ultimately, I believe that the nature of the Crusades be both defensive and offensive, with motivations of religion, greed, and power influencing each one. The Crusades came to a stop by the end of the 15th century. Despite numerous attempts, the Crusaders were unable to capture Jerusalem and lost several battles along the way. Moreover, the high cost of maintaining armies and the long distances between Europe and the Holy Land put a strain on resources, making it unsustainable to continue the campaigns. Along with this, new schisms within the Catholic Church weakened papal authority and drove motivations of further distrust between Europe's monarchs. As a result, many monarchs outright ignored official papal decrees of new crusades. However, some individual monarchs would still go on their own crusades after the fall of Acre in 1291, either against the Muslims of the Levant, other perceived Christian heresies in Europe, or, beginning in the 1400s, against the rising powerhouse of the Ottoman Sultanate in Anatolia and the Balkans. These crusades, however, did not carry the same religious fervor as the traditional eight crusades, and often had more economic or political intentions behind them. It is clear that the Crusades has had a profound impact on European and Islamic history. They shaped the political, social, and religious landscape of the Middle Ages, and their influence can still be felt today in the ongoing conflicts and tensions between East and West. The Crusades may be a distant memory, but their legacy still continues to resonate with many today.